The leaders of African nations have said nothing in decades. But things have suddenly changed on this. African leaders delivered statements before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, smack in the middle of the West, that rocked the foundations of the Western nations. A number of prominent figures exposed France and the UN's complicity and facilitation of the exploitation of African nations. Among them, the Foreign Minister of Mali, speaking on behalf of the country's military chief, made unexpected remarks. Remember that he was addressing the UN General Assembly when he audaciously claimed that France had supported terrorist organizations in Africa in order to be able to meddle militarily. He also disclosed that Mali notified the UN of this. Surprisingly, though, the UN accomplished absolutely nothing. France remained unquestioned where it was. The Foreign Minister of Mali revealed the purpose of the UN by stating this. What more could he say to embarrass France in front of the world at the UN? Let us be aware of it. The Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation for Mali, Abdoulaye Diop, denounced at the UN General Assembly session the meddling of some foreign powers, claiming that it has sustained terrorist organizations' illegal actions in the region. He was referring to someone who everyone knows. He clarified that on August 15, 2022, Mali's administration had already expressed reservations about France's conduct to the Security Council. However, because France is a permanent member of the Council, these acts appear to have gone unpunished. Put another way, the UN took no action. Even though it complained about France and followed the right channels, not a single question was posed to France, even though every European nation is aware of France's extensive involvement in Africa. Minister Diop therefore expressed his displeasure that, in spite of Mali's 10-year presence, the international response to the country's security difficulties has not kept pace with the gravity of the dangers. He emphasized that national officials frequently did not pay attention to the hopes of the Malian people. He went on to say that the multifaceted Integrated Stabilization Mission, Minusma, of the United Nations in Mali, has not made a meaningful contribution to the restoration of national territorial control, leading to a worsening of the security situation, which is currently present throughout Mali's central and southern provinces. Regarding Minusma, he denounced the organization for its purported use of human rights as a political tool, which he claimed was exacerbating tensions between communities. Based on this criticism, the government requested that the mission be withdrawn in June 2023. In accordance with Security Council Resolution 2690, efforts are in progress to execute this request by December 31st. Minister Diop also spoke about the state of affairs in Niger, denouncing the use of force and sanctions, emphasizing in particular the unlawfulness and inhumanity of the ECOWAS sanctions. Mali is adamantly against any possible military intervention by ECOWAS, stating that such actions might have disastrous effects on Niger and the surrounding area. In retrospect, he denounced NATO's 2011 involvement in Libya, blaming it as the main reason for the spread of terrorism throughout the Sahel. In order to establish just circumstances for Africa's involvement in multilateral organizations, he urged the international community to learn from the mistakes made in Libya and advocated for reforms in global economic, financial, and political governance. You see, everything was spoken in his tone. Mali doesn't feel like making requests or pleading. Instead, it will now just inform the rest of the world of its plans and carry them out. Knowing that nothing will be done to punish France, Mali will no longer waste time screaming about it at the UN. It's possible that the West is indifferent to the severely damaged reputation of the UN. Every nation in the globe is aware that if a Western nation, such as France, commits a wrong against a developing nation, it would escape repercussions. The UN will bear a heavy price as a result of this trust deficit. The idea that the United Nations is an international organization with the authority to compel nations to abide by international law was previously a facade, a delusion. Nevertheless, the UN was able to accomplish it in spite of the years of ignorance on their part and the actions of France in Africa. It is now obvious that weak and emerging nations cannot expect anything from the UN. However, what did Mali report to the UN in 2022? Tensions between Bamako and Paris persisted after France withdrew its Barkhane forces from Mali in 2022. Mali took its complaints to the UN level, accusing France in a letter to the UN Security Council of helping extremists within the country and violating its airspace. It should be noted that the letter used direct and honest language, such as aiding jihadists, which no other nation has before stated in public correspondence. In addition, the letter claimed to have other pieces of proof proving France's illegal incursions into Mali's airspace for the UN's advantage, of terrorist organizations, including the unloading of ammo and weapons. This truly cannot be believed. Mali has evidence that France was seen personally assisting terrorists. Nevertheless, the United Nations did nothing and ignored the issue. The letter listed almost 50 instances of French military repeatedly and often violating Malian airspace since the start of 2022. It was alleged that fighter jets, helicopters, and drones flew over Mali without Bamako's permission. In regards to the allegations of espionage, Diop's letter charged that the French had carried out espionage actions, such as the August 8 package drops by the French army. Following an attack on the Tessit camp, the Malian army claimed that unauthorized overflights took place, signifying an indiscriminate violation of airspace. Diop stated that this information indicated terrorist groups got substantial outside assistance and knowledge, especially the Islamic State group's Sahelian branch. With this help, Mali would have enough weapons to go on and win a war that would allow France to remain in the country. It should be noted that Mali has already accused France of invading its airspace. In April, after bodies were exhumed from a mass burial in Gassi and returned to Mali by force, similar accusations surfaced. Mali blamed French forces during that incident, and France charged Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group as well as Mali. France dismissed the claims as false information and denied any airspace infractions. Diop demanded an urgent UN meeting in his letter. Mali's right to self-defense was forewarned by the Security Council in the event that such actions continue, as they could jeopardize the stability and security of the nation. Mali Chasti said France on the similar issue earlier in September 2022. Mali was stabbed in the back by Paris, according to Abdullahi Maiga, the country's prime minister at the time. Mali turned to Russian mercenaries for support as the military administration, which assumed power in 2020 and delayed elections until 2024, steadily damaged the country's ties with France. Invoking the French government's neo-colonial, condescending, paternalistic and revanchist practices, he challenged France to rise above its colonial past and claimed that these policies had incited strong feelings among Africans fighting for their dignity. Maiga also took issue with UN Secretary-General Guterres' remarks regarding an ongoing conflict between Mali and the Ivory Coast over captured Ivorian soldiers. Maiga disputed Guterres' role, issued a legal warning, and demanded changes to the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali. We would like to remind you to watch more videos on Black history, culture, and identity by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Let's move on now. This is not a wholly novel situation. Similar assertions were made in 2021. The terrorist organization Ansar al-Din was given control of an enclave that French troops had built in northern Mali, according to the then Prime Minister Maiga. He said that these terrorist organizations acting in Mali had received training from France. Furthermore, Maiga asserted that the gangs originated in Libya. The Mali conflict began in 2013, with the intervention of France following the capture of the country's northern regions by armed rebels. Even with French forces stationed there, violence spread to central Mali as well as to neighboring Niger and Burkina Faso. Significant human casualties, population relocation, and a lack of state presence in certain regions of Mali were the results of the scenario. Because no nation could properly issue a letter to the UN Security Council without having appropriate proof, these assertions were more than mere allegations. But the UN did little in spite of evidence against France supporting terrorists and grave allegations of such sponsorship. Let's try to imagine what would have happened if France had been replaced by another nation. To gain a better understanding, let's reposition Mali and France. The UN would have authorized NATO and the UN security force to attack Mali if France had written to the UN claiming to have evidence that Mali had sponsored terrorists. Everyone is aware that the outcome would have been as follows. Still, nothing is being done against France because Mali is not a Western nation, without a private lapdog like the UN. Mali believed that the UN peacekeeping deployment ought to be terminated because it took no action against France, not even conducting an investigation. Because the peacekeeping force has not been able to adequately address security concerns, Mali's foreign minister called on the UN Security Council to immediately remove it from the nation. Furthermore, the fundamental cause was the UN's incapacity to hold France accountable for funding terrorism in Mali. The government of Mali demands the immediate evacuation of Minusma, the United Nations military in Mali. Foreign Minister Abdoulaye Diop stressed. As Diop pointed out, Minusma seems to have contributed to the issue by escalating tensions within the community, which are stoked by grave accusations that seriously jeopardize Mali's peace, reconciliation, and togetherness as a nation. UN Chief Antonio Guterres offered 3 alternatives in January to modify the operation, including as adding more troops or withdrawing all of them. He suggested an interim solution to reorganize the mission, concentrating on a small set of priorities in a report that was later made public. The head of Minusma emphasized the significance of host nation approval for UN peacekeeping missions following the Security Council meeting. Elgasim Wayne emphasized that the Council must make this choice, since peacekeeping operations depend on the host nation's consent and would be far more difficult to carry out without it. While some nations, like Russia, maintained that any suggestions should take into account the views of the host nation, other nations like France, the United States, and Britain emphasized the importance of Minusma. The Russian envoy emphasized that although the Blue Helmets' mandate did not specifically mention it, the Malian government plays a crucial role in fighting terrorism. In addition to the UN security mission, Mali requested the withdrawal of French troops. Should be aware that Operation Barkhane was first praised as a success in its early stages. By utilizing cutting-edge aerial and terrestrial technologies, the French military successfully drove extremists out of strategically important areas. However, this might have been done to provide the first impression that having French forces in Mali was worthwhile. France expanded its presence in the Sahel as a result, creating long-term bases in N'Djamena, Chad, and in Niamey, Niger, with the help of European partners. In 2017, France established the G5 Sahel Force, a 5,000-person counterterrorism force, in cooperation with Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, Mauritania, and Chad. In the end, these attempts to obtain local support were unsuccessful. Even with an extended mandate to operate internationally, regional and national initiatives suffered a heavy blow due to the substantial number of civilian casualties and charges of human rights violations by security personnel. The inability to accomplish its goals was due to a combination of structural flaws, tactical errors, and most significantly, an incorrect understanding of the dynamics of the local conflicts. As a result, there was a comparison made between President Emmanuel Macron's assessment of the Afghan conflict and French actions in the area. Later, mostly as a result of France's inaction in resolving the security issue, anti-French sentiment in the Sahel rose to previously unheard-of proportions. Protests in the streets grew commonplace, and authorities in Mali were overthrown in coups that occurred in August 2020 and May 2021, removing those who were partially collaborating with French businesses. However, how are terrorists in West Africa being funded? The Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, released a report that provides extensive details on the process, joining energies for a research project focused on typologies aimed at revealing the various ways in which terrorists, terrorist groups, and their supporters in West Africa raise, transfer, and use funds. are the Intergovernmental Action Group Against Money Laundering in West Africa and the Financial Action Task Force. Experts stationed in 5 West African nations known to have substantial and regular incidents related to terrorism provided the study team with data. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and Senegal were among these nations. Numerous financial sources for terrorists were discovered by the investigation. The top 3 ways to finance terrorists are through cash couriers, charitable organizations, non-governmental organizations, levies, and illegal arms, asset and currency smuggling. Furthermore, this demonstrates France's involvement in financing terrorism. This is a result of the French origins of the majority of NGOs in Africa. This raises a major concern that non-governmental organizations may be indirectly sponsoring terrorism, necessitating an investigation into their involvement. However, obtaining funds does not make obtaining weapons and ammo simple. The reason for this is that there are no private arms industries in African nations that could supply armaments to terrorists. Furthermore, the weapons that terrorists employ are produced in the West. It is now evident that France supplies the terrorists with weaponry, unless they continue to purchase guns through internet retailers. This argument makes sense in light of what the Mali government stated regarding France's unauthorized use of its airspace. Delivering military packages into Mali, French aircraft fly over its territory. Furthermore, as stated by the previous Prime Minister of Mali, terrorists were given a facility by French troops where they may have stored adequate weapons. As a result, French forces stationed in African nations fail to eradicate terrorism. Instead, they are instructed to assist it and carry out the terrorists' requests. It turns out that France may be the birthplace of terrorism in every nation. The United Nations is preventing investigation, which is the only way to find out the truth. Mali has repeatedly reminded the UN of its claims, but nothing has been done. It becomes evident that France is heavily involved, as evidenced by the fact that Mali is not being censured for blaming France. The UN is remaining silent as long as it can do so without raising any issues in order to prevent the situation from becoming public. France's goal was to keep terrorism alive, which is why it never ended in West African nations. There would be no motive for France to remain and take advantage of resources if terrorists were eliminated. Protests against the anti-jihadist actions of French forces occurred for this reason. The local populace finds it difficult to understand why the terrorist attacks continue, even with the French soldiers having access to copious resources. All Africans now know why French efforts to combat terrorism are unsuccessful. It was because France has never been interested in combating terrorism. Mali is now the first nation to handle this issue appropriately, sending a letter to the UN and then disclosing all the information to the General Assembly. Maybe now that they understand why terrorism in Africa will never stop, other African nations may want to write to the UN as well. Perhaps all of Africa's nations combined could pressure the UN to act as it should, if Mali is unable to compel it to act against France. The UN may revert to its original purpose of being an international body that must maintain neutrality as a result of this pressure. On the other hand, if the UN does nothing, it may become evident that it will always be a Western lapdog that serves the interests of the West. Whatever transpires, these deeds are demonstrating to the rest of the world who is trustworthy and who is not. How do you feel? Will the US ever intervene to stop the powerful Western nations from violating international law? What steps should France take to ensure that it never again funds terrorism in underdeveloped African nations? Something that ought to be illegal? Tell us what you think. And if you were aware of France's face before,